Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know we love to go deep on complex topics so you can really get a handle on things without getting bogged down, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're diving into something pretty huge for anyone who's running a business online. We're talking about the rise in lawsuits claiming that websites aren't compliant with the ADA.
The Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right, exactly, the ADA. And these lawsuits are piling up fast.
Yeah, it seems like businesses are struggling to keep up with the legal landscape, which is, it's changing all the time and it's getting more and more complex.
For sure. And for this deep dive, we've got a ton of great material from Rick Law Firm.
Yeah, they've got some great resources on their website. Plus, they've pulled together some really interesting articles from some major news sources.
Right, we're talking the New York Times, the New York Law Journal, Forbes, Reuters.
The big ones.
Yeah, so basically in this deep dive, we're aiming to break down the key issues around these ADA website compliance lawsuits. Why are they happening so much now? And what are the biggest challenges that businesses are facing?
Exactly.
So let's start with the numbers because they're pretty shocking. Rick Law Firm points to a report that shows just how much these lawsuits have exploded. In 2017, there were only 117 of these lawsuits filed.
117.
But then by 2023, that number jumped to 4,334.
Wow. That's massive growth. I mean, that's not just a little uptick. It's an explosion.
It's a total explosion. So to put this into perspective, we need to look at the big picture of all 80 Title III lawsuits, not just the ones about websites.
Right.
Our sources say that in 2023, there were more than 8,000 of these lawsuits filed in total.
8,000.
And a big chunk of those were concentrated in California and New York.
Yeah, those two states are leading the pack for sure.
It's interesting, too, because in 2024, 4 law firms were responsible for filing over 100 federal ADA Title III lawsuits each. Yeah, just 4 firms. So we're talking, Cal Equal Access Group with an incredible 2,598 lawsuits filed.
Oh, wow.
Then there's Stein Sachs with 395, Sconzo Law with 193, and Gottlieb Associates with 190.
That's just a handful of firms, and they're responsible for so many of these cases. It really gives you a sense of how concentrated this is.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. And, the main reasons for this whole situation is that there aren't any clear legal standards for website accessibility.
That's right.
I mean, everyone talks about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG, but those guidelines, they're not actually the law.
So businesses are in this tricky spot where they're being held to these standards, but the standards aren't actually legally binding. It's like,
yeah, how are you supposed to follow the rules if the rules aren't even set in stone?
exactly.
And what's even more wild is that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, the agency that should be clarifying all of this, they haven't really given any hard and fast rules.
Oh.
Yeah. Our sources even mentioned that the DOJ itself might not even be fully compliant with the guidelines they're suggesting.
Oh, that's interesting. So even the DOJ isn't meeting these standards that they're...
It's kind of like do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, so let's break down what kinds of things these lawsuits are actually targeting.
Sure.
What are the most common problems that are being flagged?
So a big one is the lack of alternative text for images.
Alt text.
Right, alt text. So someone
Yeah.
using a screen reader which reads out the content on the page, they wouldn't have any idea what that image is about without alt text.
Right, right.
And another common problem is missing captions on videos.
So people who are deaf or hard of hearing can't follow along.
Exactly.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
Well, poor color contrast is a big one, too. If the text and the background are too similar in color, it can be really hard for people with low vision to actually read the content.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, and then there are issues with online forms not being properly labeled, so they're not usable with assistive technologies.
That makes those forms basically useless for some people.
Exactly. And then there's also the lack of accessible alternatives to CAPI-TCHA.
Oh, CAP-TCHA, those are the little tests that websites use to make sure you're not a robot.
Right, like the click all the squares with traffic lights kind of thing.
Yeah, those things.
Yeah.
So are you saying some websites don't have accessible versions of those?
Yeah, which can actually block people with certain disabilities from being able to, use the website at all.
Oh, wow. So Rick Law Firm, they use some pretty strong language to describe what's happening here. They talk about this murky underworld of lawyers and serial plaintiffs.
Yeah, that's pretty intense wording.
Yeah. So what exactly are they getting at with that?
Well, they're basically saying that there are some lawyers and individuals who are, they're taking advantage of the ADA.
And the ADA was, originally meant to protect people with disabilities. It wasn't meant to be.
Right, it wasn't meant to be a way to make money.
Right. But Rick Law Firm is saying that some people are using it for that purpose.
Yeah, they're saying they're going after quick settlements and attorney fees.
So essentially, they're kind of gaming this system.
It's a per perspective, yeah.
And it goes even further than that. They talk about backroom deals and serial plaintiffs getting paid off or receiving free stuff.
Wow, so they're saying that the original purpose of the ADA is being,
Twisted.
yeah, twisted or even undermined in some cases.
And they even mention things like fabricated plaintiffs and exaggerated disabilities.
Yeah, that raises some serious ethical questions if those things are actually happening.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder if they're really interested in improving accessibility or if it's more about,
The money.
yeah, the money.
Rick's law firm also mentioned that some plaintiffs withdraw their lawsuits at the last minute. What's the deal with that?
Well, it seems like they might be trying to avoid an unfavorable ruling from the court.
So they don't want a judge to say, hey, this kind of lawsuit isn't valid.
Right, because if a judge rules against them, it could set a precedent that makes it harder to file similar lawsuits in the future.
So by withdrawing before a decision is made, they can keep filing these same types of lawsuits.
That's the idea, yeah.
And this actually ties into something the Supreme Court has been looking at.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they've been considering cases about ADA testers.
People who specifically go out looking for ADA violations.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court is trying to decide if there should be limits on these kinds of lawsuits. But apparently, in a recent case, they didn't come to a clear decision.
So it's still a bit of a gray area.
Exactly.
It's frustrating, though, because on the one hand, you have all these lawsuits, but on the other hand, the regulations themselves are so unclear.
Right. It's like businesses are caught in the middle.
Absolutely. The lack of clear legal standards is a huge problem. And even though some judges have thrown out cases because the complaints were too vague or just kind of cookie cutter, it's not consistent.
Not every judge is doing that.
Right. And then you have that ruling in the Southern District of New York. They said that the ADA doesn't apply to businesses that are only online.
Yeah, the ones without a physical store or location.
Right. So that was good news for those businesses. But then other courts, like in Minnesota, they've ruled differently.
So it's a mixed bag, depending on where you are.
Exactly. And it makes it really hard for businesses to know what to do.
It's totally unpredictable. And to top it all off, even if a business wins a lawsuit, it's really tough for them to get their legal fees back from the plaintiff.
So even if they feel like the lawsuit was frivolous, they're still stuck with the bill.
Exactly. And that just makes it easier for people to keep filing these lawsuits.
Yeah.
Now, what about those companies that promise to make your website ADA compliant and protect you from lawsuits?
Oh, yeah. There are tons of those popping up.
Which law firm talked about Accessibee specifically?
Yeah.
And how the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, went after them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so basically the FTC is saying that some of these companies, they're exaggerating what their tools can actually do. They claim to guarantee ADA compliance, but that's not really possible.
Especially with AI-powered tools. It sounds like a good solution, but businesses need to be careful.
For sure. They should do their research and not just assume that using one of these tools is going to completely protect them.
Right.
So if a business does get hit with one of these lawsuits, who should they turn to for help?
That's a good question. Ritt Law Firm actually raises a point about conflicts of interest in the legal world.
What do you mean?
Well, they're saying that some law firms represent both plaintiffs and defendants in these ADA cases.
Really?
Yeah. So they could be defending one business against a lawsuit while also representing someone who's suing a different business.
That seems like a conflict of interest.
That's what Rigg Law Firm is saying, and that's why they position themselves as a firm that only defends businesses.
So they don't want to be on both sides of the issue.
Exactly. And they offer all sorts of services like helping businesses become ADA compliant, crafting a defense strategy if they get sued, and even reviewing their insurance coverage.
So they've got a pretty comprehensive approach.
Yeah, it seems like they really focus on providing businesses with the support they need to navigate this tricky legal landscape.
Let's dig into some of the recent news coverage that Rick Law Firm highlighted. The New York Law Journal had a lot to say about these ADA lawsuits.
Yeah, they've been following this issue closely.
So the New York Law Journal reported on some cases in New York federal courts where the lawsuits were dismissed.
Oh, why were they dismissed?
Well, in some cases, the judges said that a website by itself isn't automatically considered a place of public accommodation under the ADA.
Ah, so it doesn't fall under the same rules as a physical store.
Right. And in other cases, they dismissed the lawsuits because of something called lack of subject matter jurisdiction.
Which basically means the court didn't have the authority to hear that particular case.
Exactly. The New York Law Journal also mentioned some cases in New York state courts that were dismissed because the plaintiffs couldn't prove that there was actual discrimination happening.
So they couldn't prove that the website was specifically designed to exclude people with disabilities.
Right. Or that it unintentionally disadvantaged them compared to people without disabilities.
So it sounds like the courts are starting to push back on some of these lawsuits.
Yeah, at least in some cases.
But that whole place of public accommodation question, that seems like it's still up in the air.
Yeah, the New York Law Journal said that there's a renewed debate happening in the Southern District of New York about whether standalone websites, the ones that aren't connected to a physical location, whether they should be considered places of public accommodation.
So that could have a big impact on a lot of businesses, especially online-only businesses.
Exactly. And speaking of things that are up in the air, the New York Law Journal also mentioned some criticism of the DOJ's guidance on website accessibility. They called it vague and toothless.
So even the courts are acknowledging that the guidelines aren't clear enough.
Yeah, and with so many lawsuits happening, some people are calling on the DOJ to provide more specific rules.
But it doesn't seem like they're in a rush to do that.
Nope. So moving on to Forbes, they had an article about how much these lawsuits have increased in just the first 6 months of 2023.
It's pretty crazy how fast it's all happening.
It is. And finally, the New York Times and Reuters, they both reported on something that the Supreme Court was looking at.
What was that?
Well, they were considering whether to put some limits on disability-biased lawsuits.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, specifically the ones brought by testers, like this woman, Deborah Lawfer.
She was the one who was suing all those hotels, right?
Yeah. She would basically go to hotels, not actually stay there, and then file lawsuits claiming ADA violations.
Wow.
So the Supreme Court was trying to decide if that kind of tester lawsuit should be allowed.
But they didn't reach a decision.
Nope. So that leaves things even more uncertain for now.
It's like everyone's waiting for some clear guidance, but it's not coming.
And, it's interesting. Rick Law Firm, they also have some expertise in other areas, like tariff compliance and the advertising ecosystem.
So they're not just focused on ADA compliance.
Exactly. They've got a wide range of experience in dealing with complex regulations.
That makes sense given how much they're involved in this ADA stuff. They must have a good understanding of how all these different legal issues intersect.
That's for sure.
Wow.
So wrapping it all up, the main takeaway here is that ADA website compliance lawsuits are a huge and growing problem for businesses.
Absolutely.
The lack of clear rules, combined with all the other factors we've talked about, makes it a really challenging situation.
And it can feel like a bit of a minefield for businesses. They're trying to do the right thing, but they don't always know what that is.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding lawsuits. It's about making the internet accessible to everyone.
Right. That's the ultimate goal.
So here's a question for you, our listener. How can businesses protect themselves in this uncertain legal environment? What needs to happen to create a better balance between accessibility and fairness for businesses?
It's a tough question, but it's one that we all need to think about.
If you're interested in digging deeper into this, we definitely recommend checking out the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
And stay informed about any legal developments related to ADA accessibility.
Yeah, things are changing all the time.
That's the nature of the game.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See you next time.